Hello, my name is Dorothea von Moltke, and I co-own Labyrinth Books. I want to welcome all of you who have logged in from lots of places. I just saw someone logging in from the Philippines to tonight's event with Peter Singer and Andrew Chignell, who are here to discuss Why Vegan, which is the recent collection of essays. I was just saying that this is the last event of our fall season, and then we're going to take a break for the holiday season at Labyrinth and do the course books for Princeton students and start up again with events in February. And the spring season is fully planned. I am already looking forward to lots of great events in that lineup. They will still all be virtual, so if you would like to get invitations to those events, you can follow us here on this Crowdcast platform or sign up for our weekly newsletter on labyrinthbooks.com. I am going to introduce our guests and bring them onto the screen very soon. You just noticed they're in the wings. But let me begin with sincere thanks to our many co-sponsors, all of whom have been wonderfully helpful in getting word out about this conversation. This event is one of many in Labyrinth and the Princeton Public Library's live stream discussions. I consider this partnership rare and really exceptional. And so warm thanks. Warm thanks also to our good friends at Princeton University's Humanities Council and to the Center for Human Values at Princeton, to the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University, and then finally to the Food Ethics Psychology Conference, which has been meeting on Zoom last week and then again this week. And I'm delighted that this event here has become sort of an informal add-on to their program. So that's really great. Just a bit more housekeeping. I encourage you all to buy a copy. Wait a second. I'm going to interrupt myself because I see that someone else is having trouble with echo. JP de Reuter. Could you tell me if that's still true? In the chat, can someone tell me if the echo is still bothering you? I want to see if we can troubleshoot. I'm gonna assume it's okay unless someone flags otherwise. All right. So what I was just saying is that I'm hoping that some of you will consider buying a copy from Labyrinth. It's a great little gift for the vegan among your loved ones this holiday season, maybe even better for the non-vegans, to give them some food for thought, as it were, as it was for me. Anyhow, the link at the bottom of your screen there will take you quickly to our website, and you'll get 10% off on that book and on anything else that you want to order with it. So you just need to use Singer as a promo code at checkout. And if you prefer to order over the phones or by email, I have put at the very top of the chat all the information that you would need to do that. I'm going to actually hide the chat, though, during the conversation and then bring it back up during the Q&A. And while there was a question at the very top, and that has been sitting there for days, and I'll try to make sure that we get to answering that, and it was in the chat, that's actually not where to ask questions in this platform. Instead, you'll see that some of you already have found the Ask a Question button that's at the bottom of your screen. And you can just click on that and queue up your questions as they come to you. And we will try to get to as many of those as possible. I just ask for your understanding if we skew sort of towards ethical and social and political even questions over specific personal health questions, maybe to do with veganism. I just wanted to mention that because I saw a couple questions like that already lined up. But now, why vegan? We are closing the season of events with an event that speaks to many interlocking and urgent issues of our current moment. I was listening to the BBC last week, and they had a report about Singapore's approval of lab-grown chicken meat. And then a British commentator came on to say that none of the countries that ratified the Paris Climate Accord would be able to meet their climate goals without turning hard away from industrial meat production. And so climate is, of course, only one of the urgent burning issues in play when we choose what to eat. For Peter Singer, it was actually taking the measure of the suffering of animals killed for human consumption that set him on a path to become really one of today's most clarion voices in practical ethics. Peter is Professor of Bioethics and teaches both at Princeton University and at Melbourne University. He's actually here tonight speaking to us from Australia. He's probably best known for his book Animal Liberation, which was first published in the 1970s. And the animal rights, or better, animal liberation movement was shaped in crucial ways by that important book. The other main focus of Peter's writing, besides animal ethics, are the practical ethics of altruism and of mitigating poverty, with books such as The Life You Can Save or The Most Good You Can Do. Joining Peter is his colleague at Princeton, Andrew Chignell. The two of them just co-organized the conference that I mentioned, and our colleagues in both of them have appointments in the Center of Human Values. Andrew also teaches in the philosophy department and the religion department. He is co-editor of Philosophy Comes to Dinner. And I also want to flag for you that he produced a MOOC, meaning a massive open, what does it stand for? Massive open online course called The Ethics of Eating. And he has recently updated that, so I encourage you to check that out on the website for edx.org. So clearly, we could not have hoped for a better pair to tackle the question, why vegan? And so let me now turn things over to Peter and Andrew with a couple clicks of the button. Hang on. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, can you hear me?
Now, yes. And now, Peter. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, good to be with you.
It's great to have you, and I'm going to take my view down. Off you go.
Thanks, Dorothea. Just for truth in advertising, I should say that the MOOC is still in the process of being revised. So we're going to try to run it again in the spring, but it's there, but it's the old version. Okay, I'm really honored to be here and happy to engage in this conversation with you, Peter. We've talked about a lot of these things before, but this is on the occasion of your new book, which is sort of new and sort of old, right? There's some older stuff brought together with some newer bookends. And you say in one place that this book, despite its flaws, is a challenge to every human to recognize their attitudes to non-humans as a form of prejudice no less objectionable than racism or sexism. It's a challenge that demands not just a change of attitudes, but a change in our way of life, for it requires us to become vegetarians. So that's a sort of summary statement of what the book is about. It's a strong summary. I guess I'm wondering initially just why this book now, and what are the main components of your argument?
Well, a short, truthful explanation for why this book now is that Penguin in the UK were bringing out a series of books of, called Great Ideas, and they invited me to be part of that series, and they wanted something on one particular theme. And I thought that given the rapid rise in veganism over the last decade or so, it was time for me to address this issue again. As Dorothea mentioned in introducing us, I have also worked on effective altruism and our obligations to people in global poverty, but I published quite a lot on that recently. Whereas animal liberation and those related issues about ethical eating, not so much. I did do a book called The Ethics of What We Eat with Jim Mason, I think 2005 or 2006, but that's getting to be a few years ago now too. So I thought this was a great opportunity to put together some of the older pieces I've written with some newer things, and to bring out a short popular book on this general topic. Why are people going vegan? What's significant about it? What's behind it? And I try to say something about that.
Your argument is structured. It's sort of a tripartite argument. You say there are three major reasons for being vegan: animals, climate concerns, and public health. So avoiding new viruses and antibiotic-resistant bacteria and so forth. Which of these is the most important to you?
Well, certainly, historically, the most important to me was concern about animals, because at the time when I became interested in these issues and became vegetarian, 1970, 71, I wasn't aware of climate change. I only became aware of that in the early 80s. So that was what moved me at that time. And it's still, I think, an extremely important issue. Of course, so is climate change, undoubtedly. And that climate change will also have devastating effects on both humans and non-human animals. But the suffering of vast numbers of animals, people don't realize how many animals go through factory farming each year. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization says 74 billion animals, so about 10 times the entire population of the world, are killed for food annually. And the vast majority of them would be living in factory farms. So that's an incredible amount of suffering when you think about it. And that's why that's still such a big concern for me.
You say something here about what happened in 1970, 1971. There's a chapter about the so-called Oxford vegetarians. It's a striking story about basically a group of graduate students getting together and discussing arguments and changing their ways and ultimately editing a book. I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about that background.
Absolutely, yes. It was extremely important to me, and I do want to give credit to the people who actually woke me up to this issue, because if I hadn't met them, I might have continued to go through my ethical slumbers for many years to come. You have to remember that at this time in 1970, maybe not remember for younger people, you have to realize that basically you never met a vegetarian. I mean, here I was 24 years old in 1970. I was a graduate student. I'd been through the University of Melbourne undergraduate and master's degrees. I'd gone to Oxford. And I don't think at that time I'd ever had a serious conversation with anyone about being a vegetarian or about, why we should be more concerned for animals than the standard view, which was that, we don't want to be cruel to dogs and cats. Because you didn't, at that time, you might meet a Hindu who was a vegetarian for that reason. Not very many either, probably at that time. We were less diverse than we are today. But certainly somebody who was a vegetarian for ethical reasons was pretty rare. Maybe some pacifists would also be vegetarians, but I wasn't inclined to pacifism. I'm too utilitarian, if you like, too pragmatic for that. But I happened to have lunch with a fellow student who I'd met in a course, and we were talking about something completely different. But when we walked in for lunch, he asked if there was meat in the sauce that was on top of the spaghetti. And when he was told there was, he took a salad plate instead. So I asked him, what was his problem with meat? And he said something very simple, like, I don't think we ought to treat animals like the way the animal that you're eating now had been treated. And I didn't know anything about factory farms. It wasn't publicized really at all. So I asked him more questions. He told me. He introduced me to a couple of other friends, Canadians, who played a key role in this. Richard, who was the person I had lunch with, was Canadian, and so were a couple of his friends, but there were also some English people there who were part of the group. And I read a book by Ruth Harrison called Animal Machines, the only book on factory farming at that time, and not a very well-known book either, and that was pretty eye-opening and very convincing. So that's really what got me going, and I should also credit Rosalind Godlovich and Stanley Godlovich, her husband, and John Harris, who was a philosopher at Oxford studying philosophy. They were editing a book called Animals, Men and Morals, which I regard as the first book of the modern animal liberation or animal rights era. And that's what got me into it. And I reviewed it for the New York Review of Books. Again, I was really fortunate, I think, to get an editor there, Robert Silvers, who was sympathetic to the idea of publishing what was a pretty strange and radical piece at the time. And that piece is included in Why Vegan too. So yeah, that was tremendously important for me in waking me up to the issue and getting me thinking that there is a huge moral issue here.
You just mentioned animal rights or animal liberation. So I'm curious about the difference. You're often credited with being one of the leaders of the animal rights movement, but you're also a utilitarian, and utilitarians typically are not associated with talk about rights. So what's the difference? What's at stake?
So the difference depends a bit on whether we're having a philosophical discussion, in which case we really want to be precise and we want to know what is the ethical foundation for my views, or whether we're having a sort of popular discussion in which the label animal rights stands for people who think that it's wrong to treat animals in the way that they are treated in, when they're reared for food, and in many other ways too, of course, and want to change that. So that's why, in the popular sense, I'm happy to accept the label of being part of the animal rights movement. But among philosophers, they would recognize a distinction between my views and those, for example, of the late Tom Regan, who wrote a book called The Case for Animal Rights, where he grounds it all on the idea that sentient beings, subjects of a life, as he calls them, have rights. Whereas I ground it on the idea that animals are capable of suffering, that suffering is bad, that we should try to prevent or reduce animal suffering as far as we can and give them pleasant lives rather than miserable ones.
So utility, pleasure, and pain, that goes with utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill, rights and duties and so forth go with Immanuel Kant. And you're more on the utilitarian side. Fair enough.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, I want to return to the Kant part a little bit later, but let me just ask you this. I mean, you call the book Why Vegan, but you are not yourself a vegan, as you admit in the introduction. So why do that and not sort of call it why? I mean, you could have called it Why Be a Flexa Vegan or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think it would have been as good a title, though, would it? I don't think the publishers would have liked it. So look, I'm arguing for generally vegan eating. I support that. I think there are some possible exceptions that I mentioned in the introduction, the preface. But on the whole, I think vegans are obviously not complicit in animal suffering, and they're not contributing to climate change nearly as much. They're not supporting systems of farming that are likely to generate further pandemics or antibiotic resistance. So there's strong ethical reasons for being vegan. Because I'm a utilitarian, I don't think that means that it's always wrong to eat any animal product, especially not animal products where there isn't any suffering. And so one of my exceptions is the one that Dorothea, or would be, it's not yet, the one Dorothea mentioned in her introduction. If we can grow meat in the laboratory at a cellular level and can produce that economically and with low greenhouse gas emissions, the fact that it is meat, the fact that it is chicken or beef or whatever, isn't for me a reason not to eat it. The reason not to eat it would be, was there an animal that suffered? No, there was no animal organism to produce this. And are we contributing to climate change or public health risks? Again, probably not. So that would be one example. Another example might be if simpler animals like oysters or clams don't have the nervous systems required to cause suffering, then and they can be sustainably and environmentally harvested or farmed, then that's also not a problem.
So you also say that you're willing, at least in hospitality situations, when a family member or a host is offering you the food, you are willing to also eat the eggs of free-range hens. And I wonder if you could explain that, because they do have a central nervous system, and presumably, in the chicken processing and raising industry, the male chicks get killed right away. The female chicks are grown into the hens. And the minute that they're spent, they no longer can produce eggs. They're usually gassed and dumped. So why is it okay to eat free-range eggs?
Yeah, and for those not familiar with the idea of a spent hen, what that means is a hen whose rate of lay has dropped off, so that she's no longer economic for the farmer to keep, although she might have several years more to live if she would. So I agree, there are these problems with the egg industry. The issue about male chicks is one that now in Germany, I think, and in some other countries in Europe, they've solved by detecting the sex of the chick embryo in the egg. So there's no live sentient being. It's a bit hard to know exactly when the embryo might become sentient, but I presume there's no sentient being that dies at that point. But certainly you won't find egg producers who keep hens when their rate of lay is starting to fall away. It just wouldn't be economic for them to do so. And so that's a problem. But my view, which again is a utilitarian one, is that if they are genuinely free range, the hens have good lives during the time that they're there. They're out in the grass, they're chasing insects or dust bathing or whatever that is that hens like to do. And although they're going to die prematurely, and although they're going to be trucked off probably to slaughter, and that's not going to be good, I think on balance you could say you wouldn't be doing the hen a favor by preventing the hen having that life. And that's, of course, the alternative. If nobody buys free-range eggs, there won't be any hens out there on grass enjoying their lives. So, the way I look at it is it's not a bad deal for the hen overall to come into existence, enjoy a year or two maybe, and then get killed.
So killing itself is not wrong. It's just killing painfully. Is that right?
Well, there could be an argument that killing is wrong if it prevents beings having happy lives. The more difficult philosophical question is if the being would not have existed at all otherwise.
Right.
And that's, of course, the case when we're talking about the hens coming into existence. They would not have existed. So you could say that, in terms of killing in general, killing of humans, it might be wrong because it prevents those continuing their lives. But where you have a situation where the existence of the being depends on them ultimately being killed before they die a natural death, then maybe that's not wrong.
But why doesn't that then lead to an argument that we should create as many of these hens as possible because they have a reasonably decent life, so they're bringing lots of pleasure and utility into the world? In fact, a bunch of humanely treated, happy meat sorts of animals that wouldn't have existed otherwise.
And I do think that that's the best argument for continuing to eat meat is if we have animals who really have good lives and people are taking steps to minimize, give them good lives, to minimize the suffering at the end when they're killed, then from the animal's point of view, I think it is hard to argue that it's a bad thing to consume them. In fact, as I was saying at the beginning, most of these animals, in terms of numbers, are factory farmed and don't have good lives at all. The ones that do have better lives tend to be grass-fed cattle. So beef from grass-fed cattle, I think, has fewer animal welfare objections than other forms of meat. But what it does have, of course, is a huge climate change objection. Because cattle and other ruminants emit large quantities of methane. The fact that they're on grass rather than feedlots doesn't help. In fact, on some studies, they produce more methane per pound of kilo of beef because they're slower to put on weight. So I think that's a very powerful argument against consuming beef from grass-fed cattle, but on a purely welfare point of view, the argument would be much weaker.
Okay, good. So the upshot I took from the book on that score was, look, there may be a flexi vegan sort of thing that requires a decent amount of information and investigation to remain ethical, but most people should probably just go vegan. It's easier, it's simpler, and you sort of make a statement to the people around you when you do it.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think you make a clearer statement and you're more likely to influence other people you know, if you have a very complicated set of principles that you have to explain to people, it's not going to be, I think, as effective in trying to be part of a movement that is working for a different attitude to animals entirely, as well as, of course, reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
On the influencing other people part, I mean, now your views are pretty well known. Do you find that at cocktail parties or dinner parties, people feel they have to get vegan food for you or for everybody, or else they're worried about eating meat in front of you and they feel awkward? Do you get tired of being seen as a kind of scold?
No, I've got used to that. I don't mind, and of course, I'm very pleased if they provide vegan or at least vegetarian food for everyone. That's a positive step, and I feel that's great. My influence meant that, you know, these 20 or 30 or 50 people, that no animals are dying for them, and that's a good thing. Some people worry about eating meat in front of me, others don't. That's just, you know, a variation. In fact, because it happens all the time. You know, as you know, we have lunches at the centre, or which people have a choice. You know, it's great that the centre provides vegan food for us, but there are some of our colleagues will take the meat or the dairy or whatever. So I'm used to it, and it's not as if I'm sort of personally revolted every time I see somebody take a bite of some kind of meat. That would be a difficult life to live in this society.
Right. Do you ever think back to 1970 and think, well, you know, I have really good ethical reasons not to eat the pepperoni or the sausage, and I haven't now for 50 years, but man, sometimes I lust after that cheese and pepperoni. Is that still there for you, or has it disappeared?
It's funny that you mentioned the sausage, because actually that was what I missed most at first, really. Not the large pieces of steak, but the salami kind of, you know, somewhat spicy sorts of sausages. Pepperoni, I guess, is the US equivalent. So I did miss that for a year or two. I don't think I ever actually yielded to that temptation, as far as I can remember, but I don't anymore now. And now when I look at it, it seems kind of fatty and unpleasant to me. So no, there's no attraction now. You know, the cheese, well, maybe yes, sort of like a melting cheese on toast or whatever. There are vegan cheeses now, and they've got, fortunately, a lot better over the last few years.
Yeah, a lot better.
But yeah, they really used to be like eating rubber or something. But now they're really good. So I think we pretty much got there in terms of, if you want that taste sensation, you can get it.
Fair enough. I wanted to turn to the question about speciesism and say a little bit more about that. Here and throughout the book, you draw, and your other work, you draw parallels to sexism and racism. And you complain in one place in the book that the students you met, at least at the time you were writing that particular essay, seemed willing to fight sexism and racism, but they were, quote, undisturbed by or even participants in speciesism, and that upset you. Elsewhere, you draw another parallel. So I'm just going to read a sentence from the book. You say that, quote, the typical consumer's mixture of ignorance, reluctance to find the truth, and vague belief that nothing really bad could be allowed in animal agriculture seems analogous to the attitudes of decent Germans with respect to the death camps. One more parallel, I'll just give you the third one. You claim also in the same essay that saying that veganism might be unwise because it's not clear that the diet is nutritionally adequate, quote, resembles the slave owner's claim that abolition is unwise because maybe the whole economy of the South would be ruined without slave labor. So these parallels might be offensive to some people: sexism, racism, slavery, the Holocaust. Why do you use them? Does it bother you if people are offended?
I think I use them to get people to think about their own position. As you said, I am troubled by the fact that, you know, so many people who are opposed to racism and sexism, as of course I am, don't think about their contribution to the misery of tens of billions of animals, and that's going on all the time. So I use them in order to stimulate people to think. I hope people aren't too offended by them. I try to make those comparisons in a way that, I'm not saying, for example, that what happens to animals is as bad or worse than the Holocaust. I personally come from a family that suffered through the Holocaust. 3 of my 4 grandparents were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. So I can understand people being offended, and that's why the comparison that you read is very specific. It's about the turning away from things that might be unpleasant to know about, the kind of deliberate ignorance or deliberate, and people say that. I'm sure you've had this experience. People say, "Oh, don't tell me about those factory farms. I don't want to know about it. You'll spoil my dinner." So you can easily imagine if some people said, in Nazi Germany, "Have you heard what they're doing with the Jews?" I had somebody who was on the Eastern Front, and they told me that they are killing them all. You can hear people say, "Oh, I don't want to know about that. What could I do about that?" So I think that's the parallel I'm making. I'm not saying it's as bad to kill animals as it is to kill human beings, or as bad to put animals in factory farms as it is to enslave people. But I do think there are some parallels in the kind of thinking, including, of course, that kind of sort of economic argument that we don't want to question this because it'll be bad for the economy.
Right. But I mean, speciesism is the claim that, at least on a utilitarian point of view, our pleasure and pain is just as significant as the non-human animal's pleasure and pain. And it would be arbitrary to think that ours is more deserving of protection or activism than theirs. Why don't you take human, obviously higher cognitive and maybe more complex emotional faculties to set us apart in a morally significant way from the other animals?
Well, when you say set us apart in a morally significant way, of course, we're moral agents, or normal human beings with normal capacities are moral agents in ways that non-human animals, to the best of our knowledge, are not.
Right.
I think that's true. So I do think that those cognitive capacities set us apart in a morally significant way. But in terms of equal consideration for similar interests, which is the principle that I argue for in my work, I don't think that having higher cognitive capacities shows that our feelings of pain matter more than similar feelings of pain in non-human animals. What it does mean is that we may have some kinds of suffering and also some kinds of happiness that are not open to non-human animals. Maybe we can worry about further future possibilities that we know about, which they can't. And there would be other examples you could probably think of too. So it's equal weight for similar interests, and where the interests are similar, pain of sorts that we can feel and they can feel in particular, I want to give them equal weight. I'm not saying necessarily that, well, confining, we talked about free-range chickens before, right? Free-range chickens are obviously going to be confined. They can't go wherever they like. They're in some sort of fenced field. So confining a human to an area of that space would cause a lot of suffering to that human if they knew that there was a world outside that they couldn't get to. But for a chicken, that's not going to be the case. So that's an example of where the cognitive capacities do make a difference to the kinds of interests and to what it's wrong to do to somebody.
Yeah, and I take it that if someone were to say, well, the animal suffering, that's bad, but shouldn't we focus on the human suffering first? One thing you might want to say is, by focusing on the animal suffering, we're also dealing with issues like climate change and so forth, and even maybe the workers involved in the agribusiness system. We're dealing with a lot of human suffering as well.
Yes, absolutely, that is true. So firstly, the first thing I would probably say is the assumption that human suffering matters and animal suffering matters less is itself a speciesist assumption.
Right.
Surely it depends on the quantities of suffering and the extreme nature, the intensity of the suffering. We have to investigate that at least before we could reach that conclusion. But you're right that there are these ways in which changing the way we treat animals helps humans. You mentioned climate change, which, as I said, I wasn't aware of when I wrote Animal Liberation, but I was aware of the fact that it's an enormous waste of food to grow grain or soybeans and then feed them to animals. And I was concerned about global hunger at that time. Francis Moore Lappé had written Diet for a Small Planet around that time as well. And so, we were growing, let's say, 10 pounds of grain to feed to animals, and we were getting 1 pound of beef out of that animal, which was, in terms of food value, including protein, was much less than we had in the grain or the soy to start with. So that was one of the human-related factors that I emphasized at the time.
But I have to ask the question that a lot of people will ask vegans about culture. So, how do we tell the Inuit living in the Arctic Circle that they shouldn't eat meat? It's been at the center of their lifestyle for centuries, or a tribe somewhere else where meat eating has been a traditional luxury in their culture for a long time. Or for that matter, Italians who seem quite dedicated to cheese and pork of various sorts. What do we say about these tribal affiliations?
So the Inuit and the other tribe, which maybe grazes cattle in some semi-arid region of Africa where they don't have an cultural background, or even may not even be physically possible, I don't think we do tell them to stop eating meat. Certainly not now. Maybe when we've all stopped eating meat, then might be the time to go and have a quiet conversation with them about other options and whether they can preserve their culture without eating meat. But certainly at present, when we can so easily make these choices, and yet the majority of us don't, we're in no position to talk to those other tribes that don't really have the choices that we do, or not, without completely transforming everything about their lives.
And the Italians?
Oh, the Italians, yes. Thanks for reminding. I'm amazed by. I do have some Italian friends who say, what you said about how important these things. But I'm amazed because Italy is one of the easier countries to eat vegan in. Right? They have great pasta dishes, some of which are, quite a few of which are vegan, and lots of, they do great things with vegetables. And I actually had a Italian friend who was sort of a philosopher or sociologist who I liked and admired. And his reason for not being a vegetarian was that if you go into an Italian restaurant, the pasta is the sort of the first course, right? The prima piatti,
Right.
and the more expensive course is the meat dish. Yeah,
Right.
And he said, "Oh, people will think that I'm being stingy if I go into a restaurant and I don't order the meat dish." Well, if this is really an important ethical concern, and he didn't really deny that it was, that seems to me a very weak reason for not saying, look, I don't eat meat. Can you make me a large serving of the vegan pasta?
Right. Plus, as you point out in the last chapter about cultured meat, presumably we can very soon, or even now, put the impossible meat or the lab-grown meat into the pasta bolognese. It'd be just as good.
Yeah, you can certainly get pasta bolognese meatballs made out of Impossible Burger sort of thing. That's true.
I want to open it up to questions, but let me just give you one more of mine that I think might help set up some of the questions that are coming in. You say in one place, you're talking about why we don't change. And in this workshop with the psychologists, we've been talking about how people make changes to their eating habits and why and when they stick with them. And you say, quote, people who eat pieces of slaughtered non-humans, certain way to put it, people who ate pieces of slaughtered non-humans every day just find it hard to believe that what they're doing is wrong. And they also find it hard to imagine what else they could eat. So it's sort of a problem of imagination at bottom. Elsewhere, you refer to it as just a very bad habit. So why is the habit so hard to break, especially for those who are moved by some of the ethical considerations?
I think there are lots of reasons, and I welcome the fact that you've organized a conference at which psychologists are discussing some of these issues. Perhaps, in saying it's just a habit, I wasn't quite right. I've shifted my views a little bit in that, and I think maybe we did evolve a taste towards meat. Seems like more males than females actually evolved the taste towards meat because it's a concentrated kind of high-calorie food. So there may be that factor as well, and that's why it's important that we have these plant-based or cellular-based products to mimic the taste and feel of it. But yeah, it seems that what I was saying in that passage is that when you are in the habit of eating it, you have a bias towards dismissing arguments that will make you change. And that's the kind of thing that I was saying, that people will say to you, don't tell me about it, you'll spoil my dinner. That's one aspect of that bias which leads people to want to resist the argument.
Yeah, I liked how you, in order to combat the malaise of imagination that you're describing, actually provide a recipe for vegan dal in one place and suggest that, if you can't figure out what to eat tonight without meat, here it is, and you actually give the recipe. That's great.
Yeah, that's right. And that's, I did that in Animal Liberation because in 1975, when it was published, there weren't too many great, vegetarian or vegan cookbooks. Now that's hardly necessary. And I took it out of the later edition because I thought, I don't need to give recipes. There's so many recipes around.
Right. Dorothea, I'll turn it over to you for.
Yes, Andrew, thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. I feel like this conversation has pulled on a lot of the threads in the book. I'm just actually going to hold up the book so that it's not so abstract. I don't know if this is now mirror image letters, but here's the book. And in fact, we've also reached beyond in some of the conversation beyond the book, as any good conversation will do. There are a lot of questions in the queue, and Andrew, I think with your last one, you've actually already prompted Peter to answer a couple of them, including the one that I had promised to get to from the chat. Addressing the sort of the pepperoni question and the question of habits and why it is so difficult to make the switch even when you have full conviction. So I think that we've sort of answered that. And I'm going to start. Well,
sorry to steal the thunder.
No, that's good. I'm just flagging for the person who had that in the queue. And I'm going to try to see, because we have so many questions, if I can combine some of them a little bit. There is a speculative question in the queue that considers the fact that given humans, the fact that there is such a high rate of extinction for so many species, whether if I think it links to your comments on free-range hens, and the fact that they can have good lives. So the speculative question is, since we let so many animals go extinct, if we stopped eating some of the animals that are currently domestic animals, are we doing them a favor? Might they also go extinct? And then another question, I'm going to try to link that, pushes this, in fact, a little bit further. Hang on one second. Where did it go? The queue is really long. Well, maybe you want to start with that, and then I can add the follow-up.
Sure. Yeah, let me do that. Yeah. So there would be far fewer domestic animals if we stop eating them, but we don't need to let them go extinct. The parallel here is with draft horses, the heavy horses that used to be used to pull wagons, now replaced by trucks. But they haven't gone extinct. You can still find Clydesdales and the other breeds of heavy horses that people have. I saw a couple of while ago on an organic farm run by the son of a friend of mine, and they were being used for pulling plows, but they were also, of course, their manure was a valuable asset to the farm. And there are other fanciers of these horses who keep them. So we could do the same with chickens and pigs and cows of different breeds. And I think we could keep them going, and I think we should if we end up no longer eating them. Kids will want to go and see what they look like.
Yeah. Let me move to a sort of social question. Again, there are a couple that relate to this. Steve CK is asking, if there's a moral imperative for society to become vegan, how can we facilitate a transition to a vegan society where one day perhaps there will be cultural and even legal norms to make a vegan world a reality? And connected to that is another question that sort of reflects on the fact that vegans often have to defend their choices, whereas meat eaters don't, and shouldn't it be the other way around? So maybe those can be wrapped into one.
Yes, but the question is how we do bring about that change, and I wish I knew. The conference that this is associated with is exploring that, and I suppose, Andrew, people can still register, right? If they go to the
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
website at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton. If you go for Princeton University website, select the University Center for Human Values, go to events, you'll find a link to tomorrow's session of it, and you can register. And we've got psychologists doing research and exploring this. So I'm part of a panel there too. I'll be talking about research that I did with others about the impact of teaching about the ethics of eating animals on students. It does have some impact. Obviously, it doesn't mean that there's a mass conversion of the entire classes, but it does have some impact on some students' food choices. That's one thing we can do. But I think it's really important that we've now got a reasonable critical mass of vegans in society, which means that products are in supermarkets and it gets easier. And I think if we do get cheap cellular meat, that may also make it a lot easier for people to make that change, because they won't really have to change so much of what they're eating or what they're cooking or their habits. If they do want that taste, they'll still get it. Excuse me. So I think that could help, and I'm hopeful about the development of that happening over the next few years.
Yeah, it seems that way. I don't want to skip over the question that has gotten the most votes here, and on this platform you can upvote questions, which is the sort of call for practical help. How would I argue with someone who claims that they just don't care about animal suffering, or are they just a lost cause?
Well, if they don't care about animal suffering, and they don't care about climate change, and they don't care about the risk of future pandemics emerging from factory farms or from other kinds of exploiting animals, then it's very difficult to get hold of them, right? Then I think it will take, they'll be among the last people to change, and it will take a culture in which most people have shifted for the reasons I mentioned, and those who don't care will simply start to feel embarrassed about being the ones who are still ordering meat when nobody else is. So I don't think that persuasion really works with everyone, because there do seem to be some people who just don't care about living ethically, don't care about what harm they're doing to others, and ultimately those are people who we deal with legally when it comes to harming humans, and perhaps one day we'll get to that point with animals as well.
When you say, sorry to jump in, I just taught the class the ethics of eating at Princeton, and a lot of students were moved by personal health considerations. So they'd seen movies like The Game Changers, and they've been told that a vegan lifestyle is completely healthy at every stage of life. Why not invoke some personal health considerations?
Yeah, I think you're right that people are influenced by that, and I don't talk about that simply because I don't feel I have the credentials. I have the credentials to talk about ethical arguments, but there are other people who are medically qualified or have qualifications in human nutrition, and I'm happy that they're talking about that too, because I do think that has a significant impact on people.
Yeah, apparently the movie suggests that vegans are more virile too. So that had moved one of my undergraduates this semester.
Good.
Yeah, I feel like what you're saying about the fact that we won't win every argument. Your book is a nice reminder, though, of how far this movement has come. It takes a measure a little bit of the decades since you first published Animal Liberation. And so I think it's also good to remember how much this conversation is now on the table. So that's a great thing. Let's go to a very interesting question being asked by, the name I see is just Ta. How can we pursue, and this relates to the question between animal liberation and animal rights and shifts that ground a little bit. How can we pursue animal liberation when the frames we're using are still supremely humanist anthropocentric? What are your thoughts on expanding the concept and language of the social beyond humans, so we can be inclusive of animals when we talk about social justice?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and there are various ways of doing that. Certainly, I think, when you talk about expanding the sphere of the social, you could mean different things. You could mean recognizing the social gatherings of non-human animals, those that are social, right? And there are social mammals, and many of those that we eat, chickens and cattle certainly are social animals, pigs as well. So we could recognize the significance of their social life to them, and we can certainly, we see that very clearly if we read, say, Jane Goodall's famous studies about chimpanzees, but there are many less well-known studies about other non-human animals. But maybe the question is also referring to including animals in our society. This could be that's the theme of the book by Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicker called Zoopolis, which talks about including animals within a society and within the politics of the system. So we regard them as members of our polis, but though not ones capable of voting or expressing their opinions. But that's true of some humans after all as well, and we still take their interests into account. So that's an interesting thought. The question is, how do you persuade people to do that if you haven't already persuaded them that animal interest and animal suffering matters in a somewhat similar way to the way human suffering and interest matters? So I don't know that it actually helps us to get where we want to go. It's another route, but it's a route that faces a rather similar hurdle to the route that I'm suggesting.
Yeah, interesting though. Let me go in another direction with Kate Harris's question, and this is more a question of politics and economics. Kate wants to know, how can politics shift successfully to take food subsidies away from animal agriculture and move over to vegetable agriculture to help make veganism more nationally available and affordable?
Yeah, that's a really important point, and it's a very political point, and there's been some discussion right now in the last week or two about Biden's appointment of the Secretary of Agriculture, which is an appointment that has a lot of significance for animals, as well, of course, as a lot of significance for human nutrition, because it involves the food stamp program. So I think that could be done if you had an administration that was sympathetic to that. Kamala Harris also said something in the debates about the importance of reducing meat consumption, for which she got criticized by Mike Pence, but obviously that didn't damage the Biden-Harris ticket too much, fortunately. So I'm hopeful that we will start to see more going on there. We have senators like Cory Booker as well, who's pushing that very hard. So I'm hopeful, but the American political system is such that changing farm subsidies has proven extremely difficult, even where doing so would both cut government spending, which you would think conservatives would like to see, and help people in poverty in Africa, because we're not subsidizing crops like cotton that compete with peasant cotton growers. And still they haven't really been able to get make significant changes to farm subsidies. So it's tough. It's partly the problem of the bias in the Senate towards small rural states, which doesn't really represent the population of America as a whole.
Right, which maybe means that it requires continued social pressure, right, on these topics.
It certainly requires that. And even with a lot of that, it's not going to be easy.
Right. Yeah. There's a question here that I think probably everyone grapples with to some extent, which is question of scale. It comes from Jason Apollo. As advocates for environmental veganism, how are we to reconcile the minor impact of the individual decision to become vegan with the overwhelming impact that mega corporations have on climate change?
Well, that is a very good question, but I think the mega corporations only exist and only do what they do because consumers buy their products. The classic example here will be those corporations like Tyson that produce meat products. And interestingly, Tyson in the last few years has taken up a stake in some of the companies that are producing plant-based alternatives to the very meat products that they produce. And presumably they're doing that so that they won't get sort of caught out by a big shift towards plant-based eating. But if the consumers make that switch themselves, then corporations like Tyson will increasingly put more resources into producing the plant-based products, and other organizations that are, like those that produce Impossible Burgers, the plant-based ones, will expand as well, and they will become the big corporations, and they won't be producing the environmental harms that the current mega corporations in the meat industry are.
Yeah. There are many questions still in the queue. I'll ask maybe one last one and then see if, Andrew, you have a final question. Give the final question to you before we wrap up. This one, I think Andrew mentioned it very briefly, but maybe, Peter, you can also speak to it. And it comes from Linda Monastra. Do the terrible working conditions for humans in meat processing plants have any part in an ethical argument for veganism?
I think they can, yes. I haven't emphasized that. I do mention those terrible working conditions in one of the essays in the book. Certainly, they're very poorly paid. The work is hazardous. They have to breathe the terrible air that the animals also breathe, for example, full of ammonia from the chicken manure that is in the sheds and not cleaned out for months. And I think part of the result of that is that, in fact, you get these videos of people who are taking it out on animals because no doubt they're fed up and frustrated by their having to work in that kind of job. So I think that is a factor that perhaps I've neglected. Of course, it's not only in the meat industry that we have low-paid workers, particularly immigrant workers, and they get poorly treated. So it's a broader issue, but it's certainly very prevalent in the meat industry. And actually, I noticed that Oxfam America took that up as one of its causes as well, concern for the poorly paid workers in the American meat industry.
Andrew, do you have a question that you still want to put to Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I promised to get back to Kant. Maybe the very end is not the best.
Finish on a high philosophical note.
On a high note, from Bacon to Kant, right? You say in two places, you're talking about happy meat, humanely slaughtered, the free-range hens whose eggs you're willing to consume, and so forth. And in both of those places, well, maybe not the free-range hens, but other humane happy meat, in both places you say it's still wrong. And in both places in the book, you say it's wrong because we're treating them as means to our ends rather than as ends in themselves. So that's a Kantian phrase, not a Millian phrase, certainly not a very utilitarian phrase. Is that the bedrock? Is Kant at the very bottom of your system?
I'm sure you'd be happy if I said yes to that. But so, there is something that is a bit like a Kantian view in Mill and Bentham and Sidgwick, and that is that every sentient being has, what you could say is intrinsic value, or the experiences of every sentient being have intrinsic value. They count for themselves. They're not merely means in the sense that an inanimate machine is a means. And I do think in factory farming, we treat animals as if they were machines. In fact, I quote, I think somewhere, something from one of the UK farming magazines, which says, treat the hen like a complicated piece of machinery for putting in low-priced stuff, i.e. food, fodder, grains, and getting out a high-priced product, i.e. eggs. And that's, that attitude is clearly wrong, and you could condemn it by saying we're treating the hen merely as a means, not as an end. Or you could say we're ignoring the fact that the hen is not a machine but a sentient being, and you're ignoring the suffering that the sentient being goes through the way you're doing that production. So if I have to justify the phrase, it's bad to use animals as means rather than ends, that's how I would do it, saying we're not really considering them. But where we are considering them in the more humane areas, I would say there's still a risk that you're going to reinforce the thinking that it's okay for us to treat them that way. So that would be the utilitarian explanation, that I do want to change the way we think about animals, and it's going to be hard to do that when they end up as part of your dinner, even if, in fact, they were well treated and had good lives before that happened.
I feel bad about making the last question about my Kantian proclivities. So let me just ask one quick other one, in a way for Dorothea as well. What other books would you recommend people read, and especially order from Labyrinth, about this topic?
So there are a lot of books on animals that have influenced people. A lot of people are influenced by Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals, which basically says pretty similar things to what I say in Animal Liberation, but it says it in a rather different style and idiom that maybe appeals to different readers. So that's certainly a good book to read. There are philosophical approaches from a Kantian basis, those who want the philosophy. Chris Korsgaard, who is perhaps America's leading Kantian, recently wrote a book. Remind me of the title of Chris's book, please.
Fellow
Andrew?
Creatures, Our Obligations to Other Animals. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It just slipped my mind. But it's really good, I think, because Kant himself undoubtedly was not sympathetic to animals.
Right.
But Chris Korsgaard is basically saying, as a Kantian, well, he made a mistake. He got that wrong, that part of his views wrong. And there is a kind of what Kant should have said sort of view, and that comes out in Fellow Creatures.
I love a conversation that ends with a reading list. And of course, this conversation has been so wide-ranging, as is the book. If going from the philosophical to the political to the psychological, the cultural, the economic, there's really nothing that isn't touched by the central question of our food choices. I'll just throw in in answer to your question, Andrew, that I think that our cookbook section and any good bookstore's cookbook section actually makes a really good argument these days for veganism. There are amazingly wonderful cookbooks out there now that are a guide to how possible it is to make that choice and have rich food choices nevertheless. So again, we didn't get to nearly all the questions, which is a great sign of there being just a continued interest in this topic. And I'm sorry that we didn't have time for everything, but please take your questions to the book. And maybe I can ask one of you to put in the chat one more time the details for the conference, since it was so nice that you invited people to still join if they want to. It sounds like that might well interest a lot of people who are on this call. So if you would do that, that would be great. That just leaves me to thank you both for your time, and it's been wonderful listening to you, and then to thank all of you for tuning in, more than 400 of you. I can't quite translate that because it's just a number, and I do miss our time together in the store and look forward to when that food will be possible again. But as we wait for that, let's keep joining in these virtual spaces. And as I said, this is our last event for the season, but we're going to start up again in February. So check our website for that. And I wish you could all join me in a round of applause. So I'm going to channel that applause in thanking the two of you, and wish everyone a really good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Andrew and Dorothea.